All right, good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, 7:40 p.m., and we are back here on Pump Up the Volume, where we amplify the voices of communities and really challenge the status quo and establishments that oftentimes want to sweep things under the rug. And as you know, we still are confronting a pandemic. We still are confronting social injustices, and we are, I would say, in the midst of a campaign here in Rhode Island, several campaigns, and throughout on the national level as well. And so, with campaign season out and about, we're hearing a lot of people make promises, talk about their ideas and how things would be better. But in very few instances have I personally heard anyone actually create a pragmatic vision of how we're going to not only get through this pandemic, but really get through and whole, right, and creating a stable economy and supporting people beyond just the immediate needs, but the long-term needs that will arise. So that's really the start of today. Normally, we do have guests on. We will have the pleasure of having guests on for the next 3 weeks. And they will really come from the communities, those community advocates, activists, those that are campaigning and challenging the establishment, and they're going to share their perspectives and visions. So we will include that. But for today, it's kind of setting the ground for those discussions. And so, while we oftentimes try to focus on one issue, we're kind of going to go with a bit of the flow today. We're going to get an update from Bill, who was celebrating his anniversary last week with Gabriella. So happy anniversary, Bill. We did mention it, but now that you're on the show, we want to say it again. So just for anyone joining the show, here's a quick update of what you're watching and who we are. My name is Luis Daniel Munoz. I am a medical doctor. I am a technology entrepreneur. I previously ran for governor in the state of Rhode Island as an independent. I very much believe that there is a path ahead, but the parties often hinder our progress. And so that's who I am. And I have the pleasure of having several co-hosts who you may already know, but I'll go ahead and make some brief intros. We have Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast, one of our leading independent media journalists out there. Again, someone who goes to things and really brings back news right there from the source. We have Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio, founder of the Libertarian Party here in the state of Rhode Island, and also the individual that's giving us this forum to run Pump Up the Volume. And so Mr. Pat Ford. And also we have Mr. Roberto Gonzalez, Executive Director of Steambox Rhode Island, someone who is empowering youth in Providence and throughout the state. And of course, someone who has one of the leading educational podcasts in the country. So you have, yes, four guys here, somewhat different perspectives. But overall, I believe that the ends that we hope for Rhode Islanders are one and the same, which is a better Rhode Island, and unique backgrounds, all of those things coming together to really formulate the necessary questions that will help you think about things differently, and that certainly, hopefully, will help us affect change in a more grassroots way here in the state of Rhode Island. So let's begin. As always, we have Mr. Bill Bartholomew. We have Bill give us a quick update on what's been going on in media, the pulse of Rhode Island, if you will, and some of the kind of top topics that we should possibly even think about and talk about during the show. So Bill, lead the way.
All right, a pleasure to be back on this fine show. Thanks for giving me the week off last week. I know my wife was pleased that we got to wander around Newport and see the yachts, the luxury yachts parked in the yacht land down there. Well, right now we're in an interesting spot. There's two major topics going on. Number one, back to school, not back to school. Are we going to have in-person learning? How much of this is going to be required versus, digital, quote unquote, distance learning? And then, of course, the other topic is we're back to the focus returning to the community relations issue that comes down to systemic issues such as police community relations and, broadly speaking, health equity. And they kind of merge together when you talk about Central Falls, Providence, and Pawtucket right now, where you have, the amount of COVID cases make it such that it really is totally inappropriate to send those kids back to school. And those schools, to begin with, are some of the worst in the state and, in some cases, the country. So we find ourselves kind of in a similar spot that we've been since March, talking about social inequities and how they play out in different arenas. And specifically this week, while the governor's on her way to Block Island, and I was going to ask her at the press conference yesterday if she was aware of the fifth great white shark sighting off the coast of Block Island, and if she was going to take a dip or a bath, as they say in the ocean. We ended up spending the press conference talking about why she believes that we should go back to school. And you have to question, is this an audition for a potential role in the Biden administration, or is this something that is actually her genuine belief? So that's where we find ourselves right now. Is back to school going to happen? Is it justifiable at any level? The governor seems to think, look, and by the way, talking to teachers inside the union, outside the union, they're preparing to go back on September 14th by and large. So, that's where we're at right now in terms of Rhode Island politics. Oh, by the way, there's an election next 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's awesome. And I think with your update, it says it all, right? The emphasis here being that, we have a reopening of schools, a plan. I do find it. Let's start with the facts, right? The facts is we see a massive resurgence in Europe. Spain right now is just, the cases are skyrocketing upwards. We had a first confirmed case of reinfection for COVID-19 coming out of Hong Kong. So the reason that they didn't confirm it before is they wanted to make sure that they were actually going through the appropriate test and study process to ensure that you could actually say without a doubt that a person was reinfected. And so we have that case, so there's evidence of that. Now, we know that there are going to be waves to this virus. So even if you want to displace what's going on in Spain and say, well, that's over there and we're here, we see people doing that. The commissioner of RIDE essentially said, to me and during the Equity Council, we're not Georgia. In Georgia, they don't wear masks, whatever that means. So clearly, even in the United States, we have this idea that we are so distinct from other states and that it can't happen to us. So fine, if you want to think that way, think that way. But when it comes to the reinfection, the potential for reinfection with COVID-19, we have to consider that seriously in our strategy as to whether we open schools and what that means, right? If children have the potential of getting reinfected, and they have the potential to serve as vectors, as vehicles, right, for community spread. They're going back home. They're going to their parks. I mean, we see children in the parks now, right? The parks aren't closed in Pawtucket. I'll tell you that. And so we have the potential here to really have an uncontrolled situation, especially in communities that are already disproportionately impacted, like Pawtucket, Central Falls, and Providence. And so, that's the setting, right? That's the setting. The governor in the press conference, I did hear, Bill, that she's mobilizing Department of Transportation, National Guard, RIPTA. She's creating an operations unit. She's creating this unit. And I find that, and I'm going to hand this off in a second, but I have to say, I find that idea great, right? The vision is amazing, right? You're pretty much you're mobilizing these units similar to how a military might mobilize special forces, right? And they're going in and they're doing a job. But when you dig in, and we do that in the Equity Council, and you say, what does this actually look like? When I ask the data team, is the data team connected to the testing team? And is the testing team, connected to the contact tracing team? And this was a week ago, and they tell me, no, they're not there yet. I have a hard time believing that we're going to have the National Guard swoop in and somehow be connected with the Department of Transportation and RIPTA and these specialized units for operations to make sure there's hand sanitizer in bathrooms. Like, again, this administration has been great, along with dozens of other administrations across the United States, at establishing a vision of the future. But, we need people that can operationalize and execute on things today, right? The time of the visionaries and this pandemic, I mean, it's pretty much over. They need to take a break, and we need people who can go in and connect the dots. So with that said, that's kind of my frustration. Maybe I'm jumping to outrage a little too quickly, but I do want the listeners to know that there's a lot to consider, seeing that schools will be reopening in a matter of 3 weeks. And this disease, we're learning more, and this administration is promising more, and I believe over-promising. So why don't we start with Pat? Pat, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, this week, as Bill can tell you, I've been immersed in FEMAgate. Right, Bill? FEMAgate.
FEMAgate.
Yep, FEMAgate. And FEMAgate was the notion about a week or two ago, it seems so long ago, Mr. Trump executed at the time, what appeared to be a pretty questionable executive order. 2 or 3 weeks later, it still seems to be a pretty questionable executive order. But buried in there was a promise to bring more money to folks who are challenged right now by the drop-off or the elimination of the federal benefit bump, if you will, of $600 per week. And Mr. Trump promised at the time that people would be able to get $300 a week, plus if there was a $100 kick-in, if you will, a matching grant from the state. People went crazy, declared that he had no authority to do so. He really doesn't. It was unconstitutional. And that in that week's Love Fest, the Gina Love Fest, I asked her about the program, and she went off on Mr. Trump. It was actually quite a lot of fun to listen to. There was an entertainment value there, and basically pointed out that the program didn't exist, that she had no one had called her. Okay, so cracks in that story start to emerge, and a week later, I ask her again, and this time, it doesn't exist. There's no one there. There's no there. It's a nothing burger. Fill in whatever cliche from the last year or so that you'd like. At which point, I pointed out to her that in my hands, I had a press release from one of the Midwestern states that from FEMA to the Midwestern states that they had just gotten approved from it, and that the funds would be disseminated shortly. Well, in the world of Halitosis Hall, ruh-roh, we got an issue here, because she went on record even then and said that the program doesn't exist. Well, more states started to get approvals, and, the crowd went crazy. Because, again, on a serious note, there are a lot of people suffering in the state financially. Folks always ask me as a libertarian, how do you feel about this governmental interdiction? And I say, well, the government broke it, so the government's got to fix it. They did a terrible job of this whole shutdown. They've done a terrible job of disseminating information. All in all, the entire process has been an abomination, and generational businesses are being wiped out every minute as we speak. That, of course, is not to downplay the seriousness of the disease. I've never done that here. So essentially, social media went nuts. The next day, Gina announces that they, in fact, have applied, and they were roundly approved. And, this time around, we got a little bit of a different feel that, money was going to be out. And in sort of typical Gina fashion, it went from being, this program stinks, the guy is terrible, he's an abominable human being. Well, I should say that, but the implication is there. To, by the way, good news, we've got $900 that's going directly into your bank account very shortly. I think this is, if you will, a great way to look at the entire approach that this state government has done throughout the entire time. Everything always seems to be, well, we'll tackle it next week. It reminds me of me in junior high. Yeah, I'll get to that assignment next week. Except once again, while it's funny in a sense to talk about, it's deadly serious because people are suffering at a level that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And both sides nationally are spending it for their own political benefit, which is reprehensible, even at its most basic level. So, I look at that, and I counter that with the rising, if you will, levels of protest in the city. And last night, I guess there was some type of guerrilla action flash protest on Federal Hill. Now, on one level, and I want to throw this out to you guys, I hope your reaction. First of all, I don't condone violence in any shape or form. I do, however, condone peaceful civil disobedience. And it is my contention, as all of this, by the way, the protests at politicians' houses have been roundly condemned by the poobahs and the tiskers, if you will, in Rhode Island society, roundly condemned, that we should separate to this. And that the notion that noise being made around the city shouldn't be targeted at regular people, it should be made at the political class. Well, to that I say balderdash, because civil disobedience is based on one fundamental, that folks haven't been doing the right thing when you've been quiet. They've mistaken a lot of folks in the community, if you will, kindness for weakness, and the only way you get noticed is by pissing people off. So that's the only way. No, I'm trying to remember the last recorded instance of someone in Rhode Island government doing something because it's simply the right thing to do, without any pressure. So I would throw out to the crowd.
What was the protest about, Pat? You want
The media, of course, I wasn't there. I wasn't aware of it. I was at the Sunday protest with the folks with the Cape Verdean community in Pawtucket. But this one seems to be a flash one, and it strikes me that ProvX and a number of associated groups or like groups are essentially the young people are running their own show. Thank God, and they're actually coming up with their own flash protests at government officials' homes, most notably Gina Raimondo, and in front of Federal Hill restaurants, and it's pissing people off. But isn't that the objective?
Yeah, well, Roberto, I mean, you work a lot with youth, ProvX, and the youth that have been leading that. You care to share your perspective on how things have been evolving, what their aims are, and just generally just your perspective on all of it.
I from the very deep conversation that we had on the Steambox Versus podcast 2 weeks ago with Brooklyn and Nigeli, it seems like they are a brand new organization. They are a brand new organization who is just coming together, and they are led by a lot of young students. And I'm hoping that they can avoid going the route of that Wall Street takeover movement, right? Because there were so many different leads. But that's kind of the beauty of what ProvX is doing. There's so many different leads. They're all leading ProvX, from what I understand. And in the meantime, there's a number of efforts to be diplomatic, and I feel like ProvX is not intending to be diplomatic at this moment. They intend to be disruptive. They want change. They want change now, because tomorrow is not promised. And it's something that, as an old man, right? It's something that it's just kind of not the way I do things. But if I try to take their perspective, it's beautiful, and I see it, and I understand it, and I value it. It's not the way that I move forward with my agendas and initiatives, but they're not me. I'd like to continue to support and encourage them to do exactly that.
So, Roberto, we've seen young adult organizations, Rhode Island Millennial, stuff like that. We've seen them start with, efforts to, bring inclusivity, bring diverse groups to discussions. And then we've also seen them evolve, right, into very much similar other organizations that end up falling in line. Do you feel like ProvX is more of a kind of a pure in that sense, that their aim is not to necessarily fall into, or climb up a particular ladder, but rather truly just to completely break the ladder altogether?
Yes.
Use that metaphor?
Yes. And again, I find that it's disruptive and it's uncomfortable, but it's beautiful and it's necessary right now. So it's not the way I handle things. It's not the way Steambox goes about things. But at the same time, I wanna be supportive of their initiatives, because they have a great need for justice right now in many different areas. I'm not just talking about justice, on the police front or anything else. They have a great need for justice right now. So I think that's super valuable. There's and just quickly, if I could also point out, and I know we're on ProvX right now, but I just came off a call led by Shondell and her ambassadors group that she's running with the city of Providence, and they're working on an initiative where they're questioning if we can move over some of the resources instead of having the SROs, the officers that are in the schools. So I want to thank Anastasia Williams, who was on that panel, and especially Shondell, who's been doing a lot of work there too, because they brought the young people out for a very deep conversation today. So I thought that was super dope. I know it was tangential and not exactly where we were. And if I may, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit, going back to something that Bill was mentioning earlier. Bill was talking about how the teachers are fully expecting to be prepared to start school on September 14th. And I can tell you that meetings were had today where they are pulling the faculties back in. And one of the schools that I work very closely with, that is their understanding that not only will we be back on a tiered basis, right? Certainly with the freshmen and the sophomores of the high school, but something that I'm wondering what your immediate reaction, Dr. Munoz, is to this. They are not planning on working in stable groups. Now, for the listeners at home, what this means is, because I worked with schools during the summer and they worked in stable groups. This means that groups, small concentrated groups of students, are with each other every day, all day. They do not mix with other groups, other classes. So if there's a contamination, if somebody's sick, if somebody has coronavirus or otherwise in one of the other classes, the rest of the stable groups are largely unaffected, including the teachers. They stick with the teachers. But that is not what's happening here. These high schools, which are very full, it doesn't matter if they're only doing 2 grades at a time. These high schools, which are very full, are actively planning on working without stable groups. Full mixture of students in the hallways, in different classes, mixing with different teachers. And I know what my immediate thoughts were, but I'm wondering what your immediate thoughts are.
No, I mean, that leads me to have, concerns, to say the least. I think it's irresponsible. RIDE continues to say that it's moving forward based on the science, right? Like, science is driving the decisions they're making. But so let me point out 2 quick incidents, Bill, and then I'm going to hand it off to you. But we had the testing team led by Dr. Chan and Mr. Vargas, which pretty much is Commerce, Rhode Island, combining an infectious disease specialist, Dr. Chan, who is here in the state of Rhode Island, and they're leading the testing stream. And we go through this really long discussion trying to understand what their strategy is for testing children, which, it has to be different from adults for many reasons, just because the scale of how many times you're going to have to test children, the type of test you're going to give, and the logistics and the supply demands with that. So it is a complicated thing, but by the end of the discussion, community members on the call had expressed concern as to, what about teachers? Teachers are concerned for their lives as well, right? So students and teachers, they're all in the same classroom. And there was this kind of general disregard for the fact that we know that at a minimum 25% and up to 40% of people are asymptomatic. They can be very infectious with the disease. And so it wasn't only till there was a bit of a push, a challenge that was given to Dr. Chan that he said, listen, I think mask wearing should be mandatory for all kids. And, and there was the truth, right? There is the truth of how medical professionals working with this administration are struggling to hold back their actual opinions, right? That frankly, that if we cannot mandate mask wearing across the board, mandated at the state level, the municipalities don't need to make a decision about that. We have the science, right? So the state should be mandating that across the board. If we can't even do that, then what are we doing? What are we doing? Because again, to your point, Roberto, when you start not having those pods, and then you start addressing the fact that we have another supply chain issue with ventilation system, right? Just these kind of do-it-yourself ventilation systems, it just adds to what is already a high-risk situation, which is you're going to have more students exposed to infections. If you have an infection seeded, right, you have essentially a cluster form, the cluster is going to be larger. So not only are the amount of kids that have to quarantine, stay at home, right, for 14 days, larger number, but they also now have family members. So overall, you can have a community that's more significantly impacted by quarantine. And that impact is economic, because those families that the commissioner and everyone else in the administration is saying need to go to work, they won't be able to go to work if their child comes home and is infected or even at risk because of the exposure, right? They'll have to quarantine, and that's going to impact the economics of that household as well. So, it's counterintuitive to say, let's take the risk and send the kids to school so families can make money and survive, when the fact is, if that school gets locked down, those families get locked down. And so there goes the spiraling effect. And there's, I'm going to end with another kind of experience that I've had recently, but I do want to hand this off to Bill, because Bill, I know you're interviewing a ton of people. You're getting all these different perspectives from people who believe in the virus, and those that don't still. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, right now, a tweet just came out from WPRI that they're celebrating. Great, Providence got a big grant. They're going to hire 60 new custodians to come and clean the schools. As if that is somehow going to put us over the top. Now, number one, that my dad worked in a role similar to that at the University of Rhode Island. Why should 60 individuals now be exposed to that kind of danger? Be on the front lines of cleaning up potentially a biohazard on a regular basis. But number two, it just shows you the disconnect between the end game and where we are right now. Look, we all talk to people in the medical field. We talk to people more on the scientific, transmission side of things. We talk to people who are public policymakers on a regular basis on and off record. But the one consistent thread that I have put together is that we have a goal, which is that we get past COVID, right? It's as generic as you can get. And yet nobody, of course, really knows how to do that other than to take the most cautious approach. Yet there's a race to be first from the scientific perspective. We want to develop a vaccine. From a medical perspective, we want to have the best hospital in the country. From a governmental perspective, we want to open up our schools. We want to get people back so that we can be celebrated on the Today Show as, the number one, government in the world or something like that. But we don't have that middle piece. You know what I mean? When we're all creative, all of us here, we've got creative projects, obviously. And when you build any kind of project, you kind of have the vision of where it's going to go. But in order to get there, you have to put in the work and you have to revise and constant, just like the scientific process. And right now where we're at is it's sort of like the person who goes to Guitar Center, they buy a banjo and they expect next week to be on stage at the Newport Folk Festival instead of putting in the work, the experimentation. We're in a place right now where the only thing we can agree upon is that nobody knows what's going on with this pandemic as far as a trajectory in a concrete sense. We have to rely on expertise in various silos, and one of those expertise areas should not be the public relations industry. And right now that is in the huddle and has a louder voice than others should. And last thing I'll say is that, look, again, talking to teachers, charter school, public school, private school, part-time teachers, school nurses, these are all folks I've had conversations with. There isn't one person who thinks going back is a good idea. I asked Governor Raimondo yesterday, hey, have you heard from any teacher that has said, you know what, we need to go back? We think this is a great idea. And she said that it's about 50-50 that she's hearing from, but I'd like them to actually produce those names. Let's bring them out. Next week, she's going to have a 5-day press conference. Each day, I'd like to have at least one teacher from any school district or any school. I don't care if it's St. Michael's in Newport, where they're going to set up mobile homes and tents for the kids. Bring us out one kid.
Absolutely.
Pardon me, one teacher that says September 14th, we think it's a terrific idea to get everyone back in person. I don't think you'll be able to produce 5 of them.
Bill, can I jump in for a second? You and I were both at the presser.
Of course.
And we also, Stephanie Muse has created an organization along with another half a dozen or so people. It's in one sense, it's a creature of social media, but on the other hand, they brought together about 15,000 Rhode Islanders. And the beauty of it being a creature of social media is that the communication is instant and ideas are shared. It's a very well-run site. I'll provide some links to it after the show. But we saw the protest ahead of time, and we saw the car parade. And what I thought was insulting was the way Gina Raimondo described, after she was questioned about the protests, the group of parents who were there who want their children to go back to school. And then there were the people who honked their horns. Well, God damn it, the people who honked their horns were people who are teachers, who are intimately involved. And the only thing I would agree with Gina Raimondo in that respect is these teachers bleed for their students. They're dying to get back with their students. But at the same time, they bring to the table directly in a blatant, possibly unintentional, but a blatant end run around the teachers' unions, a voluminous data pointing out the fragility of our current situation and the real dangers to both students, family, and teachers for people, even if they're engaged in these rather, I don't know, optimistic pods. I'll put it that way. So the way she compared the two was to, in a sense, poo-poo, if you will, the concerns of a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, from your take on it, is this a major crack in the wall of the teachers' unions in the state? Because I get the sense that Mary Beth Calabro is much more willing to play with the powers that be than the teachers who, quote unquote, she represents.
It's a great point. And, what it sounds to me, it sounds like, she is not willing to go back, but they're also sounding the alarm. Look, distance learning in Providence, and as well as anybody, if not better than anybody else, Roberto, is deeply flawed. In fact, distance learning anywhere is going to be deeply flawed, and I think that there is legitimate concern. But come on, I mean, right now, those flaws compared with the flaws of risking life and death, of getting into, as you constantly point out, Pat, these schools that we've spent the last since 1993, people have been bringing up the fact that Providence schools are far subpar, and now more than ever, that's been in the limelight with the Johns Hopkins report. And all of a sudden, yeah, you know what? In a pandemic, they're fine. It's better than doubling down, quadrupling down on distance learning, which, I know for a fact as well. There are some schools, and they're not in the public system, the ones I know, but they have spent, and I'll tell you right now, Blackstone Valley Prep and others who have spent the summer preparing for distance learning. You know what I mean? And why isn't the public school system kind of on that mindset of how can we improve this? How can we make sure that everybody has what they need to make distance learning for this calendar year at least effective?
Well, and that's why I countered with a point. I mean, first of all, let's be blunt. To paraphrase your point, Bill, all learning in Providence is terrible. And obviously there are exceptions. Then I'm painting with a very broad brush. But I'm looking at the results of the tests that they champion, that they ironically ended up championing later in the conversation at the press conference. And so my mantra has been to these people, let's focus on the basics. Children leave after 10 years, 12 years of a Providence education and are borderline literate. So why not take this opportunity to focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic? And as cliche as that sounds, I'm married to a teacher of 35 plus years experience, both in public and private school, and she is the recipient every year of grade school children from public schools around the state of Rhode Island who have parents are sacrificing a great deal to send them there to, in a sense, help them recover from Rhode Island public schools. So it's irrational to think that, number one, we're going to be able to get these kids back to school in time into a safe environment. We haven't been able to get them into a safe environment in 30 years. So, and it's irrational to think. I'm sorry, go ahead, buddy.
Sorry, Pat. So I just want to kind of interject a thought here too. Like, we have to also recognize that this administration and others before it really did not try to reduce the wide or the disparities with technology access for students, right? So if you're looking at distance learning, you have to see the challenges associated with it as well. Technology access, just generally the household and space available to students to actually, be able to focus. And so again, and then there's a bigger issue too, right? So the bigger issue from a tech perspective is, do you have a robust suite of solutions that has an easy to use interface for students to navigate, between different potential links, video conference technologies, et cetera? There are private school systems that have those suites designed 4 or 5 years ago, right? There are some charter schools that may have something further ahead as well, right? Because they have more financial support. At least just being a new charter school, they may have some private investors. So there's a lot of reasons for that. But again, this administration would prefer to run with the narrative that it doesn't work, instead of just acknowledging what the issues are and why it doesn't work, right? Again, for failure to understand technology, failure to operationalize technology, failure to invest in technology, all of the same things that they have, all of the same habits that this administration and others before it have had in education and healthcare and every other area, space, especially when it comes to resources for cities like Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls, right, as examples. though we know that there are other towns that struggle as well. So, one thing I do want to point out, Pat, to your earlier point, Warwick stood up to the governor, right? I thought that was interesting. And the governor certainly didn't like that too much in terms of the Warwick school system. We also saw, we heard the Commission on the Equity Council carry the governor's narrative forward. So during the entire meeting that Ride was with the Health Equity Council, there was this statement that continued it was stated time and time again, which is the others. We know who those others are. They don't represent our communities. They're not even from our communities. They're in, other communities. And the implication, I think, was that, they were of a certain economic class, of a certain color, and that those were the individuals inciting concern and fear mongering for communities that are struggling in terms of how they confront COVID-19. And I had to stand, I had to pretty much say, hey, I went to the Central Falls School District. My family's in Pawtucket. I'm a medical doctor. I'm not this other. I'm, part of a community, and I have concerns, right? And so I don't know how this administration I don't know who the PR strategists are, but I think it's a huge misstep to try to somehow gaslight the communities that were left behind in the beginning of this pandemic, as though, that didn't happen, and those communities should push their children into school. And they keep saying it's partial reopening for Central Falls and other stuff. But we all know that partial reopening with the narrative they have now is just 1 week, 2 weeks away from fully reopening if you let them, if we don't push back. So those are, again, there's some assumptions probably made there in terms of how this administration is going to move, but it's based on some historical evidence. And I do continue to have those concerns. So I just wanted to, again, draw to the point that they continue to say others, and they're somehow trying to convince us that we shouldn't be concerned when we should, just as much as anyone else. And then another point, which is distance learning is an investment that needs to be made. And this administration has not wanted to adequately invest in it. So here we are, where we're about 30 minutes into the discussion. I feel like today could certainly go several different angles, but we're going to try our best to really, again, set a foundation for what we're going to be asking all of our guests in the coming weeks. So what I want to do today is we'll do something a little different. We'll have an outrage, but I do want everyone to have a chance to really maybe have you might call it a mini statement of something that, they really want our audience to consider, something that's coming down the pipeline, something that may have already passed and that people should know about. And then you can follow up with your outrage. And if we can keep it all, guys, to about 3 minutes each at most, you can certainly be shorter than that, but 3 minutes, I think with that, we'll have given a healthy amount of information to our listeners, and we'll be ready to take off in the coming weeks with kind of carry on stories from those topics. So maybe we can start with, we'll go kind of, I'm looking counterclockwise here. Roberto, would you like to go first?
Yeah, can you reframe that one more time?
Yeah, so 3 minutes. Feel free to share, split that between something you want all of us to know. It could be upcoming youth activities. It could be a topic that we didn't touch about that you feel is very important for people to be, pay attention to. And then you can end with what is going to keep you up at night in the coming week. So
Nicole
3 minutes.
Nicole Guetta and her team just won the Metcalf Diversity Award in media. And it was a big deal. It was the second time in a row for Nicole and her group. But what makes it a lot more important this time is the first time it was almost like they were freshmen, right? Like they were excited and happy and doing their podcast. This year is a lot more like senior year, where they've been through the war, they've been through the mud. They're using their power in their podcast a lot more vindictively. So they spoke this year on the podcast about the teachers that call them the N-word. And it was significant. And there were teachers in the room, like everybody knows, it wasn't the first time, like people know that there's a teacher at that school who says the N-word to students. And she said some funny stuff to me before too. And I mean funny, not in the haha way. So So this year was a lot different because after that particular podcast, I found it strange that teachers uh, wanted to push back on her, like, hey, you guys are lying on the podcast. Nobody calls you that here. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do the podcast anymore. Like, they really gave them a lot of shit. And they won this award for their honesty and their bravery and trying to make a difference for future generations of students in that school. So to Pat's point earlier, or Bill, the schools were already broken. The schools were already like damn near uninhabitable to begin with, and I'm not even touching upon the health issues and the health hazards pre-pandemic in these schools. So to send them back to these schools right now is I just need help understanding why, especially when I'm seeing communities say to do the things that we have to do to make this safe for students to come back to school, we'd have to spend more resources than we have. So again, with all that being said, like, where are they getting the resources? They're having to get grants just to pull in extra people to clean up the schools. Like when teachers are having to do GoFundMe's just so they can have pens for their class, like, this is it's really bullshit. It really seems like the kind of thing that we should take a step back right now and really rethink this for not only the safety of all of our students, our children, our generation, and our communities, as Dr. Munoz pointed out, because it goes back to our communities, but also so that we're not wasting resources, so that we're not reinvesting 2 or 3 years worth of school budget just to make these next 2 months work instead of keeping people home, when, you know, we might end up pulling all the alarms and pulling all the students back out anyway, in which case a lot of those resources would have been a waste. I really need help understanding why and how we went from knock it off to, yeah, let's send all the students back to school. They don't even need pods. Let's just have them have kissing booths in the cafeteria and stuff. I don't understand how we got here.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Roberto. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Pat. And Pat, you have your 3 minutes.
I have my 3 minutes. Well, first of all, I want to, Mark, a few of you I've really just met in the last year, but today marks the 1-year anniversary of a trip for me personally that changed my life, both politically, philosophically, and I think humanistically. I had the opportunity to go down to Deming, New Mexico, where I spent a few days with folks in Deming, touring and helping out a little bit, mostly publicizing, because I guess that's what I do, but helping out an organization that was privately funded, privately run, that had built within an abandoned government building, if you will, a refugee center, not a detention center, a refugee center, which greeted in the space of about a year and a half over 10,000 refugees from around the world who were trying to get into the United States for a better life. And the humanity I saw, the dignity I saw, was astonishing. They took these people in, they fed them, bathed them, gave them medical attention, a little bit of pocket change when they could, new clothing. And then I had the opportunity the following day, because Donald Trump had put the squeeze on the border, to go over to Mexico and actually meet with people who were going to attempt that afternoon to get over the border. Sadly, they did not. My understanding is, as of a month ago, they're still trying. And I want to, if you will, counterpoint that with a remarkable event I went to this Sunday, which was organized by Christine Bento and too many other people in her community to acknowledge individually within 3 minutes. It was to commemorate, to observe, to point out, to develop the memories of 3 young men, Dominique Silva, Alex Pena, and of course, Joseph Farinelli, all of whom had passed within the last few years under questionable circumstances. Most importantly, as far as yesterday's event was go, without any support, without any communication without any moral handout, if you will, to help the families involved. These families have lost immediate family members. And I want to frame this as a positive, because much like a year ago, I saw a group of ordinary people who had been thrown into extraordinary circumstances. I saw a Cape Verdean community that came together yesterday in almost a prayerful spirit. It was dignified, yet pointed. Um, it was informational, yet at the same time assertive. And I think it framed a community in distress because of the absence of the support of the people they are told to go see when terrible things happen. Yet at the same time, a group asserting themselves and making it clear that you cannot mistake their kindness for weakness. And they sent a clear message on the steps of the Pawtucket Police Department. And it was a remarkable moment when Christine Bento opened the door and we all started chanting in to the Pawtucket Police Department that as a community, they're not willing to accept that anymore. As a community, they will be independent. As a community, they will be self-supporting, but at the same time will not accept no for an answer from the community of which they support through their taxes, through their hard work, through their participation. So a shout out to both groups. One thousands of miles away in Deming, New Mexico. One just a few miles away from this broadcast, if you will, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I want to applaud both of them because both organizations, I believe, represent the very best in intentions for their community, the very best in community spirit, and at the same time, totally not accepting of what's being handed back to them by the community that they're such an important part of. And I'll leave it at that.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Bill?
Boy, there's a lot of disconnect in the world right now. I've got a friend that is he's really one of my best friends in the world. We've known each other for 15 years nearly. He lives in Brooklyn. He's a first generation immigrant to the United States. He's a person of color, and he was actually a victim of gun violence a few years ago and shot in the leg as someone invaded the home that we all shared in New York. And this past week was his birthday. Well, his birthday was a few weeks ago, and one of our mutual friends who has done quite well for himself in the financial sector gave him a gift that was an electric scooter. And to see how, for a person who had been so incapacitated, who doesn't have any kind of documentation, has suffered severe health consequences as a result of this, who literally doesn't have an ID to get a job, how he was able to use the scooter, still recovering years later from this gunshot wound to his leg, to get from point A to point B, to start to get his documents together. And then all of a sudden, maybe he can get a job as a food delivery person, and things were moving in the right direction. To see how one gift like that can change a life, and something that, I take for granted, that I have a car and that I can get around and so on and so forth. Well, wouldn't you know that about a week ago on surveillance camera, it was captured, a white man stole his scooter right off the street. And literally the devastation for this individual to go from finally being empowered back down to that status, and just to watch how the NYPD, his neighborhood, no one really cared. And it's a finite case, but it just reemphasized once again to me how there are millions of stories just like his where, the struggle is so real for so many people that, again, it's just those attention to detail. You don't know how, when we talk about COVID and going back to school, when you talk about Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket, I mean, really any community where you have undocumented folks, where you have BIPOC folks, anybody who's up against it, how the basic things like getting an ID to be able to get a job, or the breakdowns in the medical system that don't allow for a person to be able to heal to the same quote unquote standard as maybe any of us on this call, or certainly many other folks in the world. That division has been in my mind yet again, and to see it impact someone so close to me, it's really outrageous, and it just echoes in my mind when we hear, let's go back to school in Providence and Central Falls. Who cares? And well, who cares if one of those kids gets sick or one of their parents gets sick? That uphill battle just to get close to back to square one is so much more challenging than it would be if the governor herself or her children were rendered ill in one way or another.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. So, I mean, just what you're all saying, I mean, honestly, I would take that as a summary of everything our listeners should know. If I were to add anything, it would just be, I would say, more of a thought that I was left with over the past 2 days. So, given all the issues with police brutality and the social injustices we're seeing, I watched a movie with my wife. It was called Queen and Slim. Really interesting movie. Some powerful themes, and one of the things that captured me the most, and I think it was just personally, it's something that always really bothers me. It's we have a political movement, especially when you think about the category left, right? We know what the right is, but with the left, you kind of have this spectrum, and we have this, tax the rich more and the rich, and demonize the rich, and I understand where they're going with that. But this movie, there was this essentially two individuals are being chased. I won't go too much if you want to catch the flick, but the key is that there's a warrant out for their arrest, and there is a certain amount that an individual that turns them in will get paid, a bounty on them, and they're African American, and it's the person that they would least expect from a similar community that they're from that turns them in for $250,000. And what really gets to me about that is, when we think about everything, when we think about the barriers in Pawtucket, right, to justice, when we think about, the guards that keep the PR at bay in school systems where people don't really understand what's really going on in schools. When we talk about, access challenges and pipeline challenges, I mean, really, like it boils down to that first barrier, and that first barrier are often individuals in our community. So when we have an administration that's saying that, we're not the ones that should be worried, don't we have more community leaders standing up against and saying that's not true, right? Why don't we have more individuals that have a foot in the door, using that foot to kick that door further open for communities, right? So that they can have access, if nothing else, to just project their voices and project their concerns more effectively. So I'm kind of left with that. It's more of an outrage that I'm hearing what you're all saying. We're all connected to the same community leaders. We know, right, that this is the truth, and yet everyone that has strategically placed themselves in a position of power, everyone's a big word, but let's say that many who have placed themselves in positions of power get there and then wield it in a way that primarily benefits them and not so much their communities. So if anyone's listening, what I would like to leave you all with today is, just this reminder that in moments of chaos, in moments of fear, in moments of in crises, there is opportunity. And I think the biggest opportunity is to stand up and lead, and to put yourself in a position of power, but not to do what others have done before you, but instead, to get there and then to lift communities up. And so, if anything, over the next 2 years, my hope is that someone out there listening will develop and nurture that courage inside of them, having listened to Pat, having listened to Roberto, having listened to Bill, and really just take that information, build on it, and push back. So, with that, I'd like to thank my co host so much for all that you bring to the table, not only in terms of knowledge, but your passion, your compassion. And I look forward to next week, where we will be back here on Pump Up the Volume Tuesday evening, amplifying voices of communities, and of course, really doing our best to serve you and to bring you the best that we have here in Rhode Island and of ourselves. So thanks so much. Hope you have a good evening, and we'll see you all next week.